conducted just a tad bit differently than council members are used to, and I'd like to explain why briefly. If you would take a look at the agenda that's been placed in front of you, you'll notice there are pretty strict time limits put on each piece. It's really important, if you want to stay on the 2 hours, that we stay to that schedule. And since we sort of know what's in the slides, it might be advantageous if we allowed Mr. Landis to kind of run this piece, if you all don't mind. Go ahead and ask questions as they come up. As we get to the end of an agenda item, though, we may go ahead and say, can we defer that question to the end? But feel free. It's got to be an exchange, so we'll keep this moving as best we can. And Dave, Tom, and I, it's such a big job that three of us have to do it.
And we did discuss this beforehand, that
yes.
we're all good with this, and so.
Yes.
But I think the people who are absent will be the only ones to drag the meeting. So anyway, go ahead.
Okay. On that note, I do want to ask two quick questions on the schedule part of this. On the week of February the 19th, which is obviously President's Day, we had talked about doing the Healthy and Productive People meeting. And it got put on the Tuesday, but then I recall many of you saying you preferred to have a later date that week when there's a holiday, because it gives you more time to do other things. So I proposed to the chair that we move it to the
important things.
Important things like family and work and earning money. So we're proposing to move that to the 22nd. The chair has approved that, and I will get that on your agenda as quickly as I can. Now, while we're talking about these things, there is one more. These presentations really do involve critical people being available to give their portion of it. And one of our best players, Ms. Garden, with Public Works, is not available on the 12th when we have the environmental quality portion done. May I have the flexibility to move the environmental quality piece and pair it with the economic opportunity piece at the end of this little calendar? If I can do that, we can keep moving forward without changing any dates, and you'll still get the same information you would have gotten. Does that sound like a permissible thing to do?
Yes.
All right. Without further ado, Mr. Landis, take it away.
Thank you.
And wait a minute, you missed the part, John, where we talked about we're not going to ask any questions until the very end.
John Camp still asking the questions Lincoln wants answered.
Duct tape.
go.
Duct tape. Thank you. Our topic today is livable neighborhoods. We're going to merge three different processes into the story today. The first of those processes is the taking charge process, which is a goal setting mechanism and a customer satisfaction method of reaching out to the public. Second of those processes, the link staff process, which is a data collection, data analysis, and then using data to direct decisions. And the last and the critical one is the budgeting process, because everything gets pushed through that reality, and that's the ultimate priority setting tool for the city. We're going to talk about goals, we're going to talk about data, and we're going to talk about budget on the topic of livable neighborhoods. And if you take a look back at the introduction phrase, there we are, it says livable neighborhoods meeting the needs of a growing community. And I pause there to tell you that we grow by 3,000 to 4,000 people a year. There's less than 2,000 people in the Malone neighborhood. We grow by 2 Malone neighborhoods every year. Now they get into existing neighborhoods, but they also create new neighborhoods. In other words, livable neighborhoods as a topic is not static. It's not just our existing neighborhoods. It's also what we're doing into the future and how we grow. We do have an overarching goal in the livable neighborhoods area, and this really encapsulates the 5 sub-goals that are in this area. Provide for safe, clean, and attractive neighborhoods to create desirable places to live. And then we ask the public how we're doing. And we use a couple of different indicators to measure us against that goal. One of them is the safety and security of the neighborhood. And if you can see, there is a theme here. That's 2012, 2015, and 2017, those 3 columns. What you see, you'll see on more than one of these slides, which is a growth of public acceptance and satisfaction across a number of the livable neighborhoods indicators. Here, the safety and security. I think we could thank any number of city departments for that, but not the least of which is our public safety folks. As you can see, there is a growth over that period of time. Here's the overall appearance of the neighborhood. And again, it shows a growth across all three. A citizen satisfaction that tells us, I think, that we're on the right path. This is the unsightly and blighted properties. I'm not sure if it's the neglected building ordinance that you passed this last year, whether it's the problem properties people, whether it's those projects that we've been doing where we've been buying up old homes and demolishing them and building new, but there's a growing satisfaction with how we're handling blighted and substandard, unsightly properties rather. Streets dipped in 2015, but a growth in 2017 of the condition of streets in our neighborhoods. And by the side of the streets, a sidewalk. Here we are pretty much flatlined at the moment. And that's probably a matter of budget. We'll talk about the budget implications of that in a moment. Here is perhaps the most dramatic effect on customer satisfaction, moving from a negative posture in 2012 to 2017, which had a significantly higher public satisfaction. So, generally speaking, I think the public's reaction to what we're doing is positive in the area of livable neighborhoods. It's had a very big impact for us in the Urban Development Department because we took an example of what happened recently and found that it was a model for the way that we'd like to do some of our business into the future. We discovered that in the Holdridge and Idlewild redevelopment, we worked cooperatively with other departments in a unified, strategic, layered response to the neighborhood needs. It was triggered by a TIF agreement, but the TIF agreement then produced a series of dominoes that improved the neighborhood in a variety of ways. So here we were on 33rd and Holdridge, and we did a redevelopment agreement and produced new opportunities, new housing, new office space, new services. And when we did that, we also had an interaction with the neighborhood who pointed out things that they wanted to have happen as well as just this product. And it introduced us to the ideas of, for example, the boulevards in the street. And if you took a look at them, you could see that a boulevard on Idlewild looked like that. What you can see is that it was in need of being redone. But if you take a look at the curb, you can see that the curb is in bad shape. If you just replant, you'll have much less satisfactory growth than if, in fact, the curbs are functioning. So we wanted to not only replant, but we wanted to do the curbs. And in fact, that is the basis upon which you're going to have a much more successful replanting. When we did the curbs, it allowed us to go back and replant, and that's what the area has looked like. When we did the curbs, we said to ourselves, and in coordination with Public Works, isn't this the right time to do a resurfacing of the street? Don't just do the curbs, but do the curbs and the street. And so we did, which meant that there was not only the boulevard, but the curbs and the street simultaneously. When that happened, we also looked at the end of that set of boulevards at a small neighborhood park that was there. And we ultimately wound up creating more amenities in that park, including something that we'll take a close-up effect of, this little attractive gathering place, gazebo by another name. And this was the product of a voluntary donation by Valentino's as part of the TIF agreement. In other words, what we had in this area was improved parks, improved islands, improved curbs, improved streets, and then the benefits of the TIF project itself. We haven't had that carefully layered a response in the past. We've had something that approaches that, but that's the most fully realized. And we thought that the public reaction, which was very demonstrative and very overwhelming, they could see dramatically their neighborhood changing before their eyes because all of those things happen simultaneously, that was a model that we'd like to use more often. And in fact, we first decided to change the Urban Development Department, and then in talks with our sister departments, we discovered a new way that we could consider doing our business. This is the Urban Development Department's reorganization, and this was our old form. I won't break it down for you, but I can tell you that there's parking, there's the downtown work, there's the community development area, and there's the housing area. And we asked ourselves, what are we doing? And the answer came back, we are actually doing 2 of the 8 goals in the taking charge idea. Taking charge says a city is 8 big ideas. And everything we do is one of 8 big ideas. And our department does 2 of those ideas, or at least we participate in 2 of those ideas. And they are livable neighborhoods, which is a taking charge goal, and economic opportunity. We do livable neighborhoods, as you just heard described, with public works. We do it with the police. We do it with the health department. We do it with building and safety. But we're all in that area together, and we've reorganized our department to have a livable neighborhoods area. We have an administration area in the middle, and they serve both of the other 2 functional areas. And then on the right-hand side is the economic opportunity area, where we have our redevelopment projects and our parking. You'll see us this afternoon with one of our projects. It's in that right-hand side, the economic opportunity. This is the way we're now organized.
Excuse me, David, can we get a copy of this presentation?
Yep. Yes. And we're going to hold all our questions until the end.
Okay. Can we have those ahead of these meetings?
Sure.
Absolutely. What we've chosen for ourselves is to serve as a convener with other departments. Can't do it everywhere, but picking prototypes, or at least a place, work to do the Idlewild Holdridge idea on purpose again as a working model. Public Works has agreed to be helpful. They're going to create a little pace in their CIP for resources to do some work in the neighborhood. Parks will do the same, and we'll do the same, so that we have resources that can be done simultaneously or in coordination with each other. This is that first overarching goal again. And it has multiple ways of being carried out. One of the ways to do that is with sidewalks. And here to tell you the sidewalk story, Director Esposito.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Public Works and its role in creating safe, clean, and attractive neighborhoods that create desirable places to live. And this is Lincoln's story with respect to sidewalks. And I wanted to make sure...
Could you talk more into the mic? Move the microphone.
Oh, sure.
There you go.
I wanted to make sure everybody understood that we're talking about 1,500 miles of sidewalk. That's the distance from Lincoln to Las Vegas. It's 7.9 million feet. So as the city grows, that number also grows. So once upon a time in Lincoln, Nebraska, sidewalks were actually maintained by the property owner. In 1990, there was a citywide election to amend the charter, and it shifted the responsibility for public sidewalk repair to the city instead of the property owner. And this was done with no additional funding to support the effort, and the assumption was at that time that existing property tax revenue was enough to sustain the repair effort. That history is really important to what you see today. And as we discovered, it wasn't enough money to maintain the sidewalk repairs. And by 2013, we had a sidewalk repair backlog of over 11,000 repair requests. 1,500 of those repair requests were priority repairs. And I just want to spend some time with the definitions here. Priority repairs are anything over 2 inches or greater in grade separation, but it also includes ADA compliant curb ramps so that we have accessibility for ADA and anyone with a disability. but also anything over a 1/4 inch in grade separation. So if we have someone who has a disability and requests a sidewalk repair, we will fix anything over a 1/4 inch. We will put in a curb ramp if they need it to access with their wheelchair. So that's important to remember. For the general population, anything over 2 inches, but for anyone with a disability, we make special fixes for those folks. At the same time, there were about 10,000 non-priority repairs. That's anything less than 2 inches in grade separation, and these are really not dangerous, but aesthetically it's just not pleasing to the property owner. We get a lot of people who might be selling their house, and so they want the sidewalks to be perfect at the time of sale, so we'll get those kinds of non-priority repair requests during that time. So that was the case in 2013. We had to do something about it to take care of the backlog. So in 2014, we came up with a funding plan to eradicate the backlog. And it consisted of $4 million in certificates of participation, or COPS funding, $1 million in federal transportation money, and those dollars had to be spent near bus stops, $1 million from the CIP, which was already programmed, and $400,000 for neighborhood repairs. We put all of that together. We had $6.4 million in sidewalk repairs. It took over 2 years to address all of those locations, 11,500 locations. And this is the taking charge indicator that demonstrates that bounce in funding, that 8.32% level of funding that we were able to invest. So I want to spend a little time with this slide. This is actually a funding indicator, and it was developed way back in 2007. At that time, the estimated cost of needed repairs was $60 million. We have an ADA transition plan. It's required by the federal government. We have to have a transition plan to bring all repairs, all sidewalk repairs into compliance within 15 years. That's the time span of the ADA transition plan. So to meet the goal here, we had to invest $4 million per year, or 6.7% funding, over that 15-year period. And you can see that we've just been struggling to meet that goal until 2014, where that bounce occurred. So on this indicator, we've been able to meet the funding goal one time. And in the biennium of 2016 to 2018, we were able to increase funding for sidewalks to a level of $1.5 million annually, and you can see that reflected in this number here. So as we were out in 2014 and 2015 doing all of that sidewalk repair work, I like to say that the reward for good work is more work, and we got a lot of requests, believe it or not. And what you can see here is the sidewalk priority requests and repairs in 2017 of 1651. So people are really calling us. They see us out and about doing repairs, and there's sort of this natural me too, I want my priority repair request fixed as well. With the level of funding that we currently have at $1.5 million, we've been able to determine that we can fix annually within the construction season between 500 to 600 repairs. And that varies in number depending on the number of curb ramps that we're also fixing. So in 2017, we hit our performance target with the number of funding we had, but clearly we have more to do. And 2018, we are actually starting the year with over 1,000 priority repair requests, and we will cut that number in half this construction season. Keep in mind, this is priority only. So with the level of funding we have today, we can't fix both priority and non-priority repairs. There are about 2,000 non-priority repairs that we track So I want to talk to you about how we address those. All non-priority repairs are tracked today, so we know their location. We do have a cost share program, a reimbursement program with the public. We dedicate about $100,000 a year so that someone, if they want to submit for reimbursement, hire their own contractor, we will pay them back, but it's at a cost of $4 per square foot. So it is a true cost share program. But if it's an aesthetic fix only, or they have their property to sell, then maybe that's the right agreement to make. But we don't make a distinction between non-priority and priority on those. And then finally, we do fix sidewalks associated with street rehab. And we do that for several reasons. One, we're getting economies of scale. We can use the same contractor to fix the street as to fix the sidewalk, or perhaps it's a nearby trail. Coordination of projects is really important to people. They only want you to handle their street once. So if you are going to go in and interrupt them, they don't want you to come back 2 years later to fix a sidewalk when you've already interrupted their use of that street for a street rehab. Compliance. I talked a little bit about ADA compliance. We will fix curb ramps. We will make sure that those quarter-inch grade separations are taken care of. It reduces city liability because we don't have trip hazards out there for folks. And of course, supporting sidewalks is important for support of the entire transportation network. So what you will see in the upcoming budget is that the data should drive our sidewalk budget and our sidewalk decisions. And what we recommend as a proposal is to double the sidewalk budget to at least $3 million per year to tackle those priority repair requests. We could double the number of sidewalk priority repairs that we currently make because it reflects the request data that we're receiving. Residents deserve safe and reliable infrastructure, including sidewalks, that support livable neighborhoods and meets the challenges of a growing community. Do you want to?
Only to add to this, that understand that this is an early budget process meeting. Okay, I want to remind everyone in the audience and up here that this is what Public Works is saying we need to do to meet the data and the goals that we have set. This is not necessarily a proposal from the administration about how to fund the budget. As you all know, we need to weigh these priorities against each other to decide where we go. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page there. That Mickey really does want the $3 million.
I really, really do.
Who doesn't?
For sidewalks.
Our next topic is street trees, and there's a good deal of data on this score, and of course the incumbent emerald ash borer problem is part of that big picture. Lynn?
Good morning. Relative to street trees, we're going to talk about really three things. One is our street tree pruning, our street tree trimming cycle. We're going to talk about street tree replacement, and we're also going to talk about, as Dave said, emerald ash borer. The Lincoln's street trees are really part of our public infrastructure, and there was a decision made in the early 1990s, in fact I think it was about 1990, to require that street trees be planted in subdivisions. So we have a development standard that requires that as new subdivisions are developed, that street trees are planted between the curb and sidewalk. And we add about 1,200 new street trees per year. I think the reasons that the committee decided to do that are that street trees have a number of values, that property values along tree line streets are increased. There are studies that that indicate in commercial areas with street trees that actually the sales are higher, that street trees are part of our stormwater management system, that tree canopy is kind of a sponge that holds some of the rainfall as it's coming down. Street trees provide homes for urban wildlife, they provide oxygen, they provide carbon sequestration. I think perhaps significantly in Lincoln, Nebraska, is that 150 years ago, this was a broad prairie, not flat, but a broad prairie with essentially no trees. And if you go to the top of the Capitol building today and look down, we really are a city in a forest. And every one of those trees, for the most part, has been planted and managed. And so you can see over the past about 10 years, we have increased the number of street trees by about 20%. The number of street trees is growing by about 2% each year. And the other factor that weighs into this is that in order for the city and the community to get the values out of the street trees, they've got to be appropriately managed. And so the number of arborists during that period has remained at 14. Here's what's happening with our trimming cycle. Standards indicate that street trees on average, or trees on average, ought to be pruned on a 10-year cycle. That means that we ought to be touching about 10% of Lincoln's street trees annually. In 2009, we actually met that standard. We were at about 11.1% that year. In 2010, we made a significant effort to get out and prune young street trees, and that's why you see that percentage go up to 18%. And then you can see, unfortunately, since that time, the percentage of trees that we have trimmed, or percentage of street trees that we have trimmed, has declined. You can see that last year we were at 2.6%. Part of the reason that we were at 2.6% last year was that we actually were dedicating some resources to removal of ash trees ahead of emerald ash borer. But you can see that the trend line really is that we are well below the standard for what we should be doing with street tree trimming. And at this point, if it wasn't for this next, or for another portion of this presentation, I'd probably be telling you that we need to be looking at hiring some additional arborists to address this trimming cycle. But that's actually kind of integrated into our EAB strategy that I'll talk about here in just a second. The other thing that we track is the request for street tree service. And you can see that they spike, but generally over the last few years, they've been up. What happened in the 2011-2012 year was that we had 3 big storm events that one year. We know that when we get a big storm event, we will get multiple calls for service, and it takes us about a month on average after every storm to get cleaned up. Last year, we saw a significant number, about 4,500 requests for service. And 2 things are at play with that. One, we did have a couple of big storm events, and so that is related. But the other thing that's happening is because you saw the street tree trimming cycle, we're behind about 6 months. We have about a 6-month backlog right now of responding to tree trimming requests. And so part of that $4,500 or 4,500 number for street tree service requests is we're getting multiple requests for the same tree, which is not a good situation to be in. So our strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about this as part of the emerald ash borer discussion, is that we're going to use, we are hiring staff, obviously, to address emerald ash borer, and we're going to use a portion of the time associated with that staff to move into trimming street trees. So we think we'll be able to trim a greater percentage of street trees on an average year. I mentioned that we're planting about 1,200 new street trees per year, and with emerald ash borer, we'll be adding about 1,000 in addition to that of new street trees in the community. Those young trees ought to be pruned about 3 times within their first 15 years, so on about a 5-year cycle. The early pruning that's done on those trees is really to lift the canopy, or is to raise the branches above the sidewalk in the street, and it's really all work that can be done from the sidewalk, and it can be done with hand pruners. And so one of the things we want to do is develop a volunteer tree pruners program where we can train people to prune trees, and we can provide volunteer opportunities for them to come in and trim young street trees, really help them get established. And we think that's an efficient way. Other communities have done this, and it is an efficient way to particularly do trimming for young trees. And then the other thing that we have done in the past and that we will continue to do is that we shift a portion of our parks maintenance staff to street tree trimming for a portion of the winter. The challenges that we're going to face, I think, long-term is that we are at some point going to have to continue to add arborists and contractual work as the tree population grows. If we're going to maintain the development standard that we have of planting trees in new subdivisions, we've got to make sure we're providing resources in tandem with adding those trees. I would tell you that recruiting staff, and I think a lot of departments are struggling with this right now, with unemployment so low in Lincoln, we really are struggling to hire staff for these positions. And I know that some of the staff positions that we've hired for emerald ash borer response, we've actually had to hire 2 and 3 times to fill the same position. And then the other thing that 15 years from now, whether it's me or whether it's the next Parks and Recreation Director, hopefully that person will be sitting here advocating for retaining the staff that we put on to help with Emerald Ash Borer, because that's one way that we can address the street tree pruning cycle or street tree trimming cycle. One slide on street tree replacement, and we actually have a goal of planting 3 trees for every 5 removed. And so really we'd like to replace about 60% of the trees that are removed either due to damage, decline, or death. I think a couple of things that are significant about this slide. One is that you probably all know about the 2 for Trees program. That is the voluntary utility billing donation program that we have in partnership with Lincoln Water System. Customers can add $2 to their water bill every other month. We collect those dollars, and we've been using those dollars to plant and establish new trees. And so that's part of the reason why you see that general trend line up. You also see a big spike in 2016. That was the year that we planted much of the trees along the airport entryway corridor. And so a portion of those trees were funded with 2 for Tree money. A portion of those trees were funded with donation money. But I think this is a positive story. The 2 for Trees program continues to be very popular, continues to be well supported. Lincoln really does love its trees and has created a positive impact on our street tree replacement cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit about Emerald Ash Borer. We have a little over 112,000 public ash trees in Lincoln, public trees in Lincoln. Try that again. More than 112,000 public trees in Lincoln, and these are the trees that are along streets, they're in parks, along trails, and on golf courses. Of those, we've completed an inventory, and 12% of our public tree population is ash tree. We've talked about Emerald Ash Borer in the past. This is an invasive insect that is now in Nebraska. In fact, it's in 31 states across the country and 2 Canadian provinces. And essentially what happens with Emerald Ash Borer is that all ash trees are susceptible, and from the time that Emerald Ash Borer moves into a community, within a 15-year period, all of the untreated ash trees will be dead. And one of the things with Emerald Ash Borer is that it happens very quickly. And so what you see is what's called the Emerald Ash Borer death curve. And you can see that from the time that Emerald Ash Borer is introduced into a community, by about the 10th year, 75% of the trees will be dead. And by the 15th year, all of the untreated ash trees will be dead. And part of the challenge with Emerald Ash Borer response is to manage that death curve, to try to not let the death curve get ahead of the community, not have a lot of standing, either dead or damaged ash trees along streets and in parks. And that really is much of our strategy. So Holy Toledo, this is Toledo, Ohio, and on one side is an ash-lined street, and we have a lot of streets in Lincoln that look just like this. And 3 years later, you can see that same street, and all of the ash trees are dead. We are trying to avoid that situation. It sounds completely counterintuitive, but our intent is to remove green trees. We want to take down the ash trees while they're alive, and I can give you a couple reasons why. One is that with Emerald Ash Borer, what happens is that the larva of the insect is cutting off the water and nutrient conducting tissue underneath the bark. And so as the trees are dying, they're also drying out. And ash becomes very brittle as it dies. And so the roots are drying out, and the top portion of the tree is also dying out. Dead ash trees they're dangerous to work with. They're unpredictable to work with because they are so brittle. And there have actually been some arborists who have been killed removing dead ash trees. The other thing that happens is that because it's so brittle, typically when you're removing limbs, you let the limbs fall to the ground. And then there's also obviously some cleanup afterwards. What happens with ash is that as it hits the ground, it just shatters. And so there's a tremendous mess that is created with removing ash trees. And so the staff spend a lot more time cleaning up after an ash tree after a dead ash tree than they would another tree or the tree if it's green. So our goal really is to be removing these ash trees while they're still alive. So the goals of our Emerald Ash Borer response program, response recovery program, is that we want to protect citizens and their property. We want to make sure that we don't have standing dead ash trees that are a liability and a potential hazard to either people or their property. We want to make sure that we're engaging our citizens in our response and recovery planning. We're actively working with neighborhood associations so that they're actively engaged in the process of removing those trees, but also then identifying what would be replanted in the neighborhoods. We definitely want to be replanting. We want to make sure that at the end of this plan that we've actually replaced essentially all of the ash trees for the long term. And you saw that 12% of our street tree population today is ash. The goal is that we not have any one species make up more than 10% of the population. So we want to plant with diverse street tree species, and we want to keep an eye on kind of the overall population so that we aren't overplanting any one species and kind of creating a similar situation for the future. So here's what we're hoping to accomplish. This is what the managed removal plan looks like, and you can see that we've taken the spike off the top of that death curve. And so we've done an evaluation of city staff time, what it costs city staff to remove trees as compared to bids that we have from private contractors. And one of the things we found is that it's actually less expensive for city staff to remove the smaller diameter trees that are 18 inches diameter and smaller. It's less expensive for city staff to remove those. And at least today, it's more cost effective to contract with private contractors to remove the larger trees. And so that's why you see this plan. The intent is to start with the smallest trees, work to the largest trees. That city staff will be removing about 10,000 ash trees that are less than 18 inches in diameter, and then we'll be contracting with private contractors to remove the larger trees. We also anticipate that we're going to have to use chemical treatment as a way to keep some of the trees alive for a period of time so that we can remove them while they're alive. We'll be using private contractors to do that work, and then the tree planting effort will also be contracting with private contractors to provide and plant the trees. So there's going to be significant involvement by the public sector in this effort. Oops. Yep, that's the right one. And so our strategy really is, as I said, community outreach and engagement. We're going to be, on Thursday, we're going to be having a news conference to announce that our draft or our Emerald Ash Borer Response and Recovery Plan is available for review and comment. We're going to allow citizens who have an ash tree that's next to their home on the street or in a park that they're very passionate about to adopt that tree and provide chemical treatment on an ongoing basis. I mentioned that we anticipate that we're going to have to treat a portion of the ash trees to manage the death curve. We want to make sure that we're replacing ash trees on a one-for-one basis, and we're going to be, as I said, creating this citizen pruners program to prune young street trees. Short term, we think we're going to need about another $230,000 in additional funding during the 2018-20 biennium. And that really is primarily for replacement of ash trees, or replacement of planting replacements for ash trees. And then the big expense that is out there, and we'll continue to monitor where emerald ash borer is in Nebraska. When we get to the point that we have to do treatment, the treatment is very expensive, and the first round of treatment is going to be significantly costly. You have to treat the trees every 2 or 3 years, but that first round of treatment is likely to be well in excess of $1 million. I also said that I would talk a little bit about how we're going to use the arborists from the Emerald Ash Borer response team to help with the tree pruning cycle. We are hiring 9 arborists who will be involved in removing smaller diameter trees and then grinding and backfilling the stumps. And based on a time analysis, we anticipate that the tree removal crew is going to spend about 100 days a year involved in removing 1,000 trees. After that, we can shift them to street tree trimming. And so they'll have about 150 days a year that they can be involved in street tree trimming. A crew can, depending on the size of the trees, they should be able to trim between 5 and 25 trees a day. And so on average, we think that we could impact the pruning cycle by 2 to 3% by shifting the time, or shifting that time of the Emerald Ash Borer crew to tree trimming when they're not involved in ash tree removal. So that's kind of our strategy right now.
What is the timing on the 9 arborists?
9 arborists, about half of them have been hired at this point, and we're finalizing getting those hired. You'll remember that we had $950,000 identified in the budget for each of the bienniums last year, or each of the years in this biennium, last year and this year, and we're buying equipment and we're hiring staff. And sometime within the next month or two, we should have all 9 staff hired and trained and actually out there working in the field.
Sidewalks and street trees are part of this first overarching goal. Provide for safe, clean, and attractive neighborhoods to create desirable places to live. There's one more aspect on this first goal, which is the maintenance of our parks and our recreation facilities.
Before we begin, Tom, can you have a quick time check? Can you tell us
Yeah,
what we're
we're
at?
right on. We're
Right on.
target.
Okay. Sherry, do you want to take a couple of quick questions, or you want to keep going?
Let's keep going.
Okay. We'll keep going. When we talk about Parks and Recreation maintenance, we divide that into 2 categories. One is kind of the routine maintenance, the mowing and the snow removal and the tree trimming. And then we also talk about maintenance including capital repair and replacement. So that's repair and replacement of infrastructure to keep it in good condition and open to the public. When we had done the Taking Charge survey in the past, you'll see the figures here in just a little bit, but park maintenance has been a concern. The level of satisfaction with park maintenance has been a concern. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about mowing. The last time we did the Taking Charge survey, I asked to see all of the comments, and I would tell you that the vast number of comments about park maintenance are either about mowing or about trimming, and so that's why I thought it'd be worthwhile talking about mowing. We have 3 types of grass management that we do in park areas. We do regular park mowing. We mow almost 1,600 acres, and today we mow those active use areas, and those are the areas around playgrounds and around park shelters and our play fields, our informal play fields. We mow those on a 14-day cycle at a height of about 4 inches. For budget reasons, this was changed probably 6 or 7 years ago. We went from a 10-day cycle to a 14-day cycle. We also, I think, as you know, we have a program that we call long grass management, and there's about 715 acres in parks that are mowed 2 to 4 times a year at a height of 6 to 12 inches, and these are passive areas in the parks. And then we also have a program that we call Prairie in the Parks, and the intent is that we are planting or reseeding some of the long grass areas to native prairie grasses and wildflowers, so that over time we're gradually reintroducing prairie into the parks. And one of the advantages of the Prairie in the Parks maintenance program is that you mow those areas about 1 to 3 times a year. So, but the Prairie in the Parks area is actually, aesthetically, they look better. They're better suited to drought, but I think equally as significant is that they require less maintenance over the long term. So long grass management, majority of that is in regional parks. We actually started this program and then we added acres incrementally. And in regional parks, about 53% of the acres in regional parks are in long grass for about 301 acres. Community parks, about 42% of the land in our community parks is in long grass management, about another 300 acres. And these are the ones where we get most of the concerns. About 35% of the acreage in our neighborhood parks is in long grass management. It's about 112 acres, and we don't have any long grass in the mini and pocket parks. Prairie in the Parks. This is, like I say, a program where the intent is to go in and reseed long grass areas to native grasses and wildflowers. And our goal has been to plant about 25 acres a year. And you can see that on occasion we've achieved that, on an occasion we haven't. In 2012, it was a dry year. We knew that year by May that we were headed into a dry season, so we only seeded 1 acre. And then from 2013 to 2017, we've had, as you know, 3 very wet early growing seasons. And the staff were very actively involved in mowing, and the time that you want to be seeding native grass and wildflowers is typically in late May or early June. And the last few years we've been incredibly busy in mowing, and we just haven't been able to pull the staff away to get Prairie in the Parks established. One of the things we want to talk about is should we be thinking about doing this contractually as opposed to doing it with our own staff, just because we have such a difficult time pulling staff away from pretty basic park maintenance activities to do this seeding effort. So you can see here's what happens with the pruning cycle. In 2012, we were at about 11 days for the peak period, and the peak period is the end of April through the first part of July. And I think, as you all know, at home, I'm mowing about every 5 to 7 days that time of year. We're trying to get parks mowed on a 14-day cycle. In 2015, we had a significant spike that year, and that was really because it was so wet that spring that we had a difficult time just keeping up with the mowing, and we had a couple of big mowers break down that year. So it was kind of the perfect storm that happened. And then the last couple of years, we've actually been below that goal of 14-day pruning cycle. So here's what's happened with the level of satisfaction. As part of the Taking Charge community survey, we asked citizens to rank their satisfaction with park maintenance, and it's essentially stayed steady, to be perfectly honest. Our goal has been to be at about a 75% satisfaction rating, or an average of about 3.75. We hover right around 3.5%, and that includes that. I think you see there's a slight uptick from 2012 to from 2015 to 2017. That may be related to the fact that we actually restored 43 acres of lawn grass in neighborhood parks to regular mowing. Perhaps that's the reason for the uptick. Some recommendations that we want to make is we want to continue to emphasize the benefits of lawn grass and prairie parks, because there are environmental benefits of those programs. There's also budget benefits of those programs. During the next Taking Charge budget conversation, we want to talk with citizens about what should we do about this standard. One consideration is 3.75, is that too high? Should we actually accept the fact that a 3.5 is actually going to be an acceptable level? Or are there some other things that we could be doing that might increase that satisfaction rating? And then I talked a little bit about prey in the parks. We want to see if we can't figure out a strategy to achieve or exceed that goal of getting 25 acres of lawn grass area seeded down to prey in the parks annually. And so that's park maintenance. And now I'm going to, if it's okay, dive right into our infrastructure repair and replacement. We manage infrastructure that has a value of more than $195 million. That doesn't include the value of the land, and you can see kind of the lists and the types of infrastructure that we are managing. Over the past, this is really, I think, the third time we've updated it. We've developed a 10-year facilities plan, and the intent really is that we want to make sure that we've got a strategy for keeping the infrastructure repaired and replaced on an adequate cycle to keep it safe and accessible to the community. We review all of the infrastructure within the department every 2 years. We do it ahead of the budget process and the capital improvement project biannually. This last review, we identified that we need about $3 million annually for facility repair and replacement of general fund facilities, and we need about $760,000 annually for our golf infrastructure. And we've got a gap of about $850,000. You can see our existing funding sources. The last few years, we've had about $500,000 of general tax revenue going to the Parks and Recreation Capital Improvement Program. We have about $275,000 of revenue coming from lease of cell towers. And then Keno is just over $1.3 million is going into that fund. One of the things that we're going to want to talk with the City Council about is this concept of energy savings performance contracts. And essentially what this does is it looks at infrastructure where, by replacing the infrastructure with more energy efficient systems, that we can actually generate some savings, and we can use that savings then to pay the cost for those upgrades. And if we were to do that, that would cover about $130,000 a year of the gap in the Parks and Recreation infrastructure repair and replacement program. And then we still have that unfunded piece that I'll talk a little bit about here at the end. Here's what golf looks like, and even though this looks bad, this is exciting. We used, the unfunded gap used to essentially be 100%. And we've been working pretty hard over the last few years to put together a strategy to make sure that the courses are adequately maintained on an average basis, but that we are gradually finding funding to make sure that we can be doing the repairs that we need to do to keep the system in good shape. So right now, the golf CIP surcharge, golfers pay $1 per 18-hole round into a fund that goes to infrastructure repair and replacement. That generates about $122,000 a year. There are a couple of cell towers on golf property, and the lease from those generates about $55,000 a year. And then we have a sponsorship and advertising agreement with Benchcraft that the City Council approved last year that generates $20,000 a year. So we actually, right now, we've gone from zero to about a quarter of the golf infrastructure repair and replacement need is funded. The good news is in 2021, the Holmes Clubhouse will be paid off, and if we keep the surcharge in place, we think that we'll have about half of the golf infrastructure need funded if we keep that surcharge in place at that time. So our strategy is that as I mentioned, we want to talk about the possibility of funding some infrastructure projects that would have increased energy efficiencies using energy savings performance contracts. We'll continue to seek grants and donations for facility renovation. A tool that Omaha uses that I've been advocating that we consider is they have quality of life bond issues on a 10-year cycle. And once they got it established, got the voters to approve that increase in the property tax levy, what they do on a 10-year cycle is they identify a group of projects, they take those to the community, they get them approved, and they complete those projects, and then they put together another list, and they've done this on a 10-year cycle. I think that's one way we might be able to address that $720,000 a year gap in the general fund facility repair and replacement, is getting onto a cycle like that. And then, as Carl knows, probably as everybody knows, golf is an extremely competitive market. One of the things that we hear nationally is that golf programs are not reinvesting in their infrastructure. So we're a little bit odd right now. It's because we're trying to make sure we have a strategy to reinvest in our infrastructure, but it's a competitive market. So one of the things that we've done and that we will continue to do is educate the golfers about the importance of having funding to reinvest in the golf infrastructure. So that's part of our strategy there.
Thank you, Lynn.
Your timing's perfect.
Thank you.
The overall arching goal, as I said, for this area was the provision of safe, clean, and attractive neighborhoods, a desirable place to live. There is a second sub-goal, and that is to reduce neighborhood disorder by providing services that abate nuisances, resolve issues, resolve conflicts, and support quality of life. Chad Blaha and the building and safety folks do a lot of that work, and they've also got some data that supports what it is that they do. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, so far we've talked a lot about a lot of the public components to public infrastructure components to what we are talking about, livable neighborhood concept. So with this item, we're talking about problem properties, and that is the way we look at it, the private sector or the private property component to the livable neighborhoods. Single-family housing, multiple family housing structures, and the accessory buildings associated with those type of properties. So when we talk about that, we look at that in a couple of different ways. A general appearance, paint as an example, paint coverage, debris in the yard, or we work with the county for weeds in the yard, that sort of thing. And then we also look at minimum safety requirements for habitation. These type of things are structural utilities and egress. Example of structural is the roof sound. Are the gutters in place? Are the porches, do they meet requirements for staircase dimensions, that sort of thing. Utilities, one of the things that are required for the code, are all the utilities in place? Do they have proper plumbing? sanitary sewer, water source, or heating during the cold months. We also have to ensure that properties have a properly functioning heating system. And then also egress is another example. We have to ensure that fire codes and other related requirements are met. This is, as an example, you've seen some of the shows, The Hoarders. We see a lot of that where they don't have even a practical means of egress, let alone proper per the code means of egress. So those are just examples of some of the things that we get involved with in terms of the livable neighborhood concept in private properties. When looking at this, we really didn't have a measurement, so we are looking at utilizing two new measurement tools that we're going to start to track. One of them is kind of repeat violators, and to talk a little bit about that, this is talking about repeat valid complaints on the same property. And when I say valid complaints, I don't really like that tool, but that's the way we use it, because anybody who thinks enough to call in and make a complaint feels that it's valid. But the way we look at that is a valid complaint is one that results in a violation of the various codes that the city has available to them. The property maintenance code is the big one. Health department has a couple of those codes, that sort of thing. And a couple little preliminary numbers on that. About 70% of all complaints that we receive are valid complaints, meaning they do result in some form of a violation that needs to be corrected. Of those 70%, of that 70%, 17% of those are repeat calls. And we got those numbers from doing kind of a 3-year study. So within that 3-year time period, 17% of them were repeat calls to the same place. And we also drilled down a little bit deeper. There was a certain percentage of those that occurred within 12 months of the previous. Some of them within 6 months and 3 months. On average, it was about 272 days between those repeat calls. So we look at this as kind of a measure of the performance of our problem property resolution program. So we're going to take a look at measures on how we can affect that. The other item is length of stay on our red tag list. And red tag differentiates a little bit in that it means the property is no longer safe for habitation, whether it's structural or one of those other items that we had listed. Maybe they don't have, maybe their furnace system broke down and they no longer have heat, or if their sewer system is malfunctioning and they need to have good sanitary. Right now, as you can see, the average length of stay on the red tag list is 250 days. Sounds like quite a bit. It did to me when I saw the number. But contrast that to the historical, going back to as long as we have records for red tagging, the average is in excess of 350, approaching 400 days. And so we have seen some increase there. We think part of that is due to the neglected building registry that Dave mentioned earlier, that allows us to, it's another tool that allows us to put some pressure on these property owners that have these properties that have just been sitting and they're not doing anything with them. Most of this work is accomplished through our housing preservation section within building and safety. It's made up of 4 inspectors and 1 chief inspector. And they're in charge of the housing code enforcement, which is currently a complaint-based, primarily a complaint-based system. Meaning we don't go out looking for properties most of the time. We're just responding to what people feel like calling in. part of the tools in there is the neglected building registry, like I said. And that program has been, in our mind, very successful. Currently, we have 15 properties on the neglected building registry in various states of progress. To date, we have seen 15 to 20 properties come on and off of the neglected building registry, where prior to that there would have been no city mechanism to force anything to happen. And so that means they've either been demolished or renovated or repaired through private sector means. There's only been 1 or 2 out of those that the city has had to step in and cause the building to be demolished because it was declared dangerous. So we really feel good about that program. The other thing that this section does do is apartment licensing program. It's closely related to the housing code because they have a lot of this. They share a lot of the same requirements, but those are the 2 primary responsibilities for that section. One thing I did want to add about the red tags. Sorry about that. Red tags. We do red tag on behalf of other departments. Our department is the red tagging authority, I guess, for the city. So we do track some of those as well. For an example, health department has the codes on mold and critters. So we will red tag on behalf of the health department for those items. And we are currently in the market, as you will, for a new chief housing inspector. We've been without one for quite some time. We've looked at opportunities to change the nature of that position a little bit and put more of a focus on this livable neighborhood concept. Add some proactive approach or proactive emphasis into how they run and to how the section is operated. And I guess it's not really fair to say livable neighborhood versus complaint-based code, because we still need to use the complaint program in terms of how we get our results. But perhaps it would have been more fair to say livable neighborhood concept versus strictly complaint-based in that regard. We look to hire by the end of February or so, and we're going to look for that chief to propose measures, procedures, and any possible legislation required in the tracking of those 2 new indicators, and assess the performance for that. And then this kind of leads us into how this affects our budgeting process. Currently, complaint-based activity is meant to be the general fund portion of the section, and apartment licensing has a fee revenue structure to it. So, on a workload measure, we do about 60% complaint-related work and 40% apartment licensing-related efforts. Now, I was corrected a little bit by some of the staff. Maybe it's closer to 50%, but it's still not close. And also, we have to take into account some of the complaints do occur at properties that have a function or a operable or operating apartment license. So there is some kind of interplay there. But we, as you see from the slide, 25% of our funding is general fund, and the rest of that is fee-based. So it does not make up that difference. So what our challenge is to not increase that gap, that funding differential, moving forward, and perhaps maybe make up a little bit of ground through some other methods. And so that will come up in our budget requests.
Just to clarify, the 60% complaint-related piece of your workload does include departments, just not the apartment licensing component.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. We do have part of the apartment licensing component is an annual review, annual inspection that we do go in. That is not included in that.
And the fees are completely generated, though, for the licensing piece and not the
Correct.
complaint piece in apartments.
Correct. Correct. Yep.
All right, so that's the second of our goals. Goal 3 under the Taking Charge goal of livable neighborhoods is to create quality and diverse housing options and encourage redevelopment that respects and revitalizes older neighborhoods. Part of that story comes from planning, part of that story comes from urban development. Paul Barnes batting as the utility infielder for David Carey, who is ill today with food poisoning.
Uh-oh.
I'm sure none of us envy him today. It might be nice to be home today, but not for that reason. Paul?
All right, thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. I think this does have multiple angles for this topic, and so what I'm going to touch on is what the planning department tracks in terms of the housing within this affordability discussion. And kind of a theme within this data that we have from our department is this balancing act. As Dave had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Lincoln is growing, and we're consistently growing at 3,000 to 4,000 new residents every year. In order to accommodate for that growth, we need to be investing in our infrastructure, both for growth on the edges of the city, but we've also seen some of that in terms of redevelopment within the existing city. So again, thinking about that balance that we need to achieve. And as I said, this is part of the housing discussion within the affordability topic. We're going to focus on the lot supply and how that, in terms of growth on the edges, does accommodate for that increase in residents. So here's a graph that shows a few things that we track in our department. The top line in red there is what we call all approved units. So this is when we have a community unit plan, planned unit development, preliminary plat come in for approval. This development typically happens on the edge of the cities in those new growth areas. The green line in the middle there is what we track in terms of final platted dwelling units. So as development occurs, as properties are annexed, they do get final platted into individual lots, which then creates a unit once it's built upon. And then that bottom line there in blue is the actual building permit activity. Again, all of this is for the new growth areas, which are on the edge of the community. So we have had some rebounding from that Great Recession in terms of the building permit figures. At this point, based on a 3-year average, we're looking at about 1,300 new residential units. Another important and vital activity that our department completes is the review of the final plats. And as they come in, we're charged with completing that review initially within 20 days. And we do have a consistent track record of doing that at or near 100% for several years now. So that's an important thing that we do achieve to keep that development moving forward. In looking at the supply of cumulative or overall approved dwelling units, based on the 3-year building trends, we do have about 13-year supply. And we did some review of historic figures back to the year 1997, and over that 20-year period, the average lot supply was about 11 years. And so over that period of time, compared to where we are now, we're slightly above that. And in order to talk about and define what we mean by healthy lot supply, being at or around that 11-year mark is our historic average. And so having it at about 13 years seems to be healthy. In terms of the final platted lots, we're at about 2.75 years worth of supply for single-family units. This has fluctuated over time. Of course, that's based on the development factors. So how many final plats are coming in, what developers are doing individually. But we looked at a couple of peer cities, and we looked to Omaha and Wichita in Kansas. In terms of Omaha's final plat supply, that's at 2.7 years. And with Wichita, they're at 3.4. So again, trying to define what a healthy lot supply is in Lincoln, looking at those peer cities, we appear to be pretty much spot on. This map on the slide is what we call a heat map, and it's to indicate where we see and where we have seen building permit activity for single-family residential. This is for the period of 2014 through 16. In those red areas that you see kind of east and northeast and then to the southeast, that's where we're having the majority of our building activity. But you do see that we have growth in all quadrants of the city, which is a goal of the comprehensive plan, and it is something that is and continues to happen. A lot of this is directly tied to the investments that have been made to the infrastructure. And so you can see along the eastern edge of the city, in Prairie Village North and Waterford Estates, those developments and that significant activity is directly tied to the Stevens Creek improvements. And so this is planned for, this is happening, and it does provide for that efficient growth and investment in our dollars. What we had done a little more recently with our update to the comprehensive plan is to look forward, basing on the supply that we have today, also with looking at new areas that we need to or should be opening up for additional development. And during that update, what we had done is to continue to open up land in the growth priority tiers in the Stevens Creek area. So you see that arrow there pointing to some red color on the map. That again is continuing that investment of the Stevens Creek trunk. We then looked to the southwest and had opened up additional land over there, again tied to the investments that we're planning for that you will see in the CIP for a southwest trunk over in that area. We also did amend some of our land uses during conversations with owners and developers. That would be along Northwest 48th Street. Changing that from commercial and industrial uses over to residential also opens up more land for additional units. So with all of these changes, looking at adding capacity of a little over 6,200 dwelling units. That red area, which is all the areas that I'm talking about here, really anticipates growth up to the year 2025, 2026. That's tied to the availability of the infrastructure, so the utilities, and then directly ties into how we implement that through the CIP. We also look at and track the number of units that are being developed as infill or redevelopment projects. And over the past 3 years, we've had a significant number of those projects. Actually, 30% of all of the residential units were infill or redevelopment. So that's about 1,500. The comprehensive plan acknowledges this and plans for an additional 8,000 units of infill and redevelopment up to the year 2040. We do know that to accommodate the growth that we see today and into the future, we're going to need at least 40,000 additional units. And within the future service limit that we have today, that growth can be accommodated. And something else kind of significant to note is that over the past several years, 44% of all new housing units were multifamily. We do recognize in the comprehensive plan that around 40% of the housing types will be multifamily, but we've actually seen that number higher, possibly because of the number of infill projects and redevelopments that have been happening. So action items for our department, we will continue to track the building trends, the development trends, and the platting. We will continue to work with developers, the various departments, and this body on infrastructure commitments and make sure that we are following through on those. And as we meet with various groups throughout the community, just talking about this relationship among platting and building, and also with our urban development department partners, the affordability aspect of housing in Lincoln. Here are a couple of large budget implications to note. These are both related to the infrastructure that I've mentioned as we continue to grow. You're aware of the proposed sales tax initiative for transportation in terms of maintenance across the community, but also in terms of growth on the edges. And then also the utility rate discussion having to do with sewer and water improvements. Based on some assumptions in the overall planning process, we think that we can work with the development requests to continue to grow in those areas, but we need to continue talking about how that funding is approved and available for continued growth.
We have another share of the housing options responsibility, and that's to look at home ownership and rentals. We do have a standard or an indicator that we look at, and that is home ownership in Lincoln compared to about 8 comparative cities, similar populations and makeup. We generally start from the notion that home ownership is good for a neighborhood. It shows stability, it has people who have invested in that, they're likely to have eyes on the street, participate in PTAs, participate in neighborhood associations. However, it is a truth in America and in Nebraska and in Lincoln that home ownership is trending downwards, not upwards. When you just saw the number that Paul gave you, that 44% of the units that were being done since 2010 were multifamily, it tells you the growth of multifamily units, in part because there are fewer as a percentage of the population of nuclear families. There are more living arrangements that are not based necessarily on marriage, and also a growing and aging population that would just as soon not scoop snow or mow grass and live in a place that they would like to. So we have a change nationally that is reflected in our city. However, we're moving a little less precipitously than other jurisdictions. So here's Lincoln versus Madison and the growth. What you see is that while we both have more home ownership than Madison, we're also losing it at a less precipitous rate. That's also true for Raleigh, North Carolina. It's pretty similar to Spokane, Washington, but again, we have more home ownership. It's not true, on the other hand, with Wichita, Kansas, who has more home ownership than we do. And those are positives, but you can't rest on that phenomenon, nor can you rest on the phenomenon I'm about to demonstrate to meet housing needs. We need more options than what we have now. There is something that we do and we do well, and it is affordable, but it's only affordable to a portion of low and moderate income people, and that's owning a home. This is the average price from 2007 to 2016 of new houses, median incomes nationally. It's cheaper in Lincoln. This is Lincoln's number. And that's about 17 to 19% lower than the national average. And when you start from the beginning to the end, we maintain a handsome 17 to 20% difference. Existing housing is cheaper than new housing. Here's the national existing housing. Now, in some cases, it's existing housing nationally is more expensive than a new house in Lincoln on the left-hand side. But when you get to the right-hand side, you'll see that a new house in Lincoln is more expensive than an existing house nationally. The important number for us, and it's a critical aspect of the work that we do in urban development, is this number. This is affordable housing in Lincoln. And the difference between our number and the national number is about 50%. In other words, the difference between what that blue line is and that salmon line is as a percentage of the 153. It's about 50% difference. It's the phenomena that you know of when you have friends who move here and say, my goodness, I bought a lot of house for the amount of money that I was bringing in from someplace else under normal conditions. Not always, but under normal conditions. Somebody moves from California is beside themselves with the price of housing in Lincoln, Nebraska. And that works for low and moderate income people by making it affordable. But only people who can have a 30% of their income translate into a mortgage that would buy a house can participate in this. Because if you don't have an income large enough so that 30% of it buys you a mortgage, you don't get the benefit of what this is. What we do in my department, and have historically for the last 10 or 12 years, is to spend our money in getting more longevity from that bottom line. We do new roofs, we do furnaces, we take the existing housing stock and we add life to it. And we do that to the tune of about $2.5 million a year. Federal money, pass-through or program income, but we're working on that salmon-colored bottom line and making those houses last as long as possible. And here's where our money comes from for the most part. It comes from the federal government, 2008 to 2018. As you can see, we are somewhat down with respect to with CDBG, and we are down with respect to home money. I'm not sure I see on the horizon some huge investment in new HUD money that's going to add to those. So we use those resources, and we use it for the existing life of housing in Lincoln. Here is the general fund of our department. We don't use this money for furnaces or roofs. We do it for personnel, however. Some of our personnel, however, is in the other costs that are there because we can consider that program income. What I'm saying is that for the last 10 years, we have a relatively modest increase in general fund budget in the department. If you were to ask us the budget implications for what we do, you'd have to say we do not have resources to add significant amounts. We need to do one. If we're going to get into assisting the rental market, we're going to have to take away from what we have now. The second alternative are regulatory controls that a number of other cities use, but we do not in Lincoln, which is where you take those 44% of multi-family growth numbers that Paul was pointing to and say, if you're a developer and you're going to create 10 new units, one of them or two of them need to be for affordable housing. But it's a way of controlling the marketplace and not letting the market do what it wants to do to achieve a regulatory end. What is true is that for the people with the lowest incomes, we do not have a city form of assistance that makes their affordable housing options greater. We trust the Lincoln Housing Authority. We trust Lincoln Habitat for Humanity. We trust Section H voucher. We hope for NIFA and their tax financing, tax credit problems. But right now, we are husbanding our money to elongate the life of an affordable housing stock. So that's the direction that budgeting will take for our area. And we move to community spaces and programs. And what could enhance neighborhood vitality more than Pat Leach and the libraries?
I cannot imagine. Cannot imagine. But I'd like to wish you each a good afternoon. And I believe I'm almost batting cleanup. I'm close to it anyway. So congratulations to all of you as well. I want to talk through, I'm just looking to see which button I need to push here. Oh, gotcha. Thank you. Library satisfaction. The indicator that the library takes a look at here is what we want to do is maintain the satisfaction rate from the city survey at a level of 4. And the point I want to make about the satisfaction survey is that it's about people's expectations. The same level of service will be evaluated differently depending on a person's expectations. So we're paying a lot of attention to that as we take a look at this number. I'd also want to make clear that in the survey, this is people throughout Lincoln. This was essentially the random sample group. This is not made up of people who use libraries only. It's the full community who was included in that number.
I'm going to interrupt Pat just to say this is the highest rated of all of the taking charge neighborhood livable services. We all live in the shadow of the libraries.
That's our story, and we're sticking to it.
Absolutely.
I could build on that, but I realize you all have limited time. So let me just continue going, but thank you, Dave. One of the questions that I hear a lot going forward that I want to address kind of at the start is just what do libraries look like going forward? Because we know that for the most part when people hear libraries, they think books. And for a lot of people there's a belief that books are all going electronic, therefore the need for the kind of libraries that are neighborhood assets may no longer be useful. We're looking at those numbers quite a bit, and frankly it looks as if that pendulum is not swinging as quickly toward electronic books, and we're not sure that it's really swinging all the way. So we're monitoring people's preferences as far as how they read, but print remains really quite strong. We also make books available electronically in a variety of ways through ebooks or downloadable audiobooks. So when I look at this number, I see a couple of directions that we need to pay attention to. One of those is what's found within our buildings, what staff, what resources, what facility is it, as well as then the electronic resources that we make available. These are the different measures that we used in terms of this number. So what I will be doing next is taking a look at these measures essentially one by one. The bar that's the second from the left, again, is the overall service of the public libraries. So this number is about comfort and cleanliness, and the difference between these numbers is pretty much insignificant. What's clear, though, is that neighborhoods make a point of pride of their local library. And so as we're thinking about the comfort and cleanliness of the building, we know that they're a point of pride, and especially where people in Lincoln put a lot of value in education, the condition of their library is important to them. We have some concerns, frankly, in this area in that 10 years ago, due to some budget changes, we moved from having library staff who provide facilities maintenance to contracting for that. Now, overall, that's been a really good situation for our libraries, but as we look toward the next budget, we're thinking it probably makes sense to bring on a staff person who has expertise in facilities maintenance to work with that contract, provide some continuity, and provide sort of some general understanding of what goes into that. So that's something that we'll be taking a look at as we go forward. We do, though, have quite a few projects coming up. So as we're looking potentially at a new downtown library, there are quite a few branch projects that may allow this gentleman here to continue reading his newspaper in a comfortable, clean chair in a building that's heated and cooled as it should be. Our website does list a lot of those potential branch projects, and so it's something that we're continuing to look at just in general. Now this year there's been a lot of discussion, of course, about a potential new central library. In 2017 we did quite a bit of public input in regard to that. Now our time today isn't the time to discuss that in depth, but I do want to note that as we continue to have conversations about downtown, we think about livable neighborhoods, downtown as a neighborhood with a growing population, a large population in comparison to our quadrant libraries, a population with the lowest per capita income of the other libraries. And so we're thinking, how do we, within our current facility as well as future, do things really well in terms of working with the South of Downtown initiative, working with Prosper Lincoln, making sure that we're doing a really strong work with families and children, and just continuing to work with different initiatives in the community to build that up. We see the new Central Library as supporting families who are struggling to make ends meet, as well as connecting to the energy of Lincoln's community. So those are some of the things that we have in mind as we look at those aspects of comfort and cleanliness. Now this chart is showing the general availability of items such as books, magazines, DVDs, and CDs. And here I'm kind of returning to that theme of a foot in two different worlds. So we know that there are a lot of people who see libraries traditionally and use libraries traditionally.
She looks at. It's because you're old.
What? Anyway.
I always believed in cyber libraries, if you recall, back to the year 2000.
I do recall. So we have people who use libraries in a very traditional way, who stop in our buildings and check out materials. We have a lot of people, that same group of people, who are checking out downloadable books, whether those are ebooks or audio books. So when we have a new title come out, you may have heard me describe this before. A new title comes out, we're getting several print books. I'll look at somebody else to say, we'll get a large type book. We'll get that audios on CD because people use those. We'll have to buy an electronic downloadable audiobook as well as a downloadable ebook. So it's a lot to keep track of. Our ebooks are purchased through what are called third-party companies. We work with certain companies to provide those services. We don't get the great discount on buying new books from those companies as we do from traditional book jobbers, which is one of the things that we have to deal with as we budget. But one of the things that we pay attention to is going back to the keyword of expectations. When we're making electronic books available, people are accustomed to getting those immediately. And some of our ways of going about purchasing ebooks sometimes involve a wait, and that's an area where then we're not meeting expectations. So we're watching how those companies are operating and watching how that impacts our budget as we think about the general availability here. So when we're thinking about the challenge about providing what people are seeking, it won't surprise you to learn that we may be seeking additional funds for materials, so that as we're looking at responding to people's demand for our downloadable items, we're not pulling a whole lot away from the demand for traditional items also. Then thinking about hours of operation, one of the things I want to mention here is that a lot of people's use of the library anymore is to stop by and use our Wi-Fi also. So Wi-Fi is available throughout the time that we're open. We did, in the last few years, greatly expand our broadband capability, and then also followed up by really strengthening our wireless setup so that we're able to do that well. We use Keynote funds for that. So when we're thinking about people stopping by for that use, we know they are likely to be bringing their own device into the library. We still have personal computers that are available for people to use at the library, and plenty of people do still use those. But we're paying attention to that kind of use as people come in and need libraries to be open a variety of hours. So when students come in with their Chromebooks, you may have heard me mention before that our wireless setup has a system where an LPS student who enters with their Chromebook is automatically connected to the LPS network for them to do homework at the library, which we think is a great spot for them to do that. Now again, some budget cuts a while back resulted in some changes in hours, and Bennett Martin Library is not open Monday through Thursday 6 to 8 p.m. as 5 of our branches are. So one of the things that we'll be looking toward in our budget request is restoring the evening hours at Bennett Martin Library. We think that would benefit both people who live in the downtown neighborhood as well as people who work downtown who maybe want to stop by and use the library after work. So that's something that you'll be seeing in our budget request. Now this indicator is use of the website for library services. We're a little bit under where we want to be on this one. What's interesting about this one, of course, is that the way people access information changes over time. The library does have a website, but I can tell you that when I do my own library work, when I'm looking at my account, I'm using an app. It's called Book Mine. If you're not using it, I'd be glad to give you a tutorial. It's a great app. I use an app to access my electronic resources. So if I'm going on Overdrive to download a book, I'm using a great app called Libby. If I'm using Hoopla, I'm using their app. So I do a lot of my work not directly through our website. Then a lot of what people do electronically with the library is find out, does the library have a certain book? Do I have materials checked out? That goes through our website, but again, it's a third party that we contract with for that software. So when we're looking at the use of the website, we are certainly thinking about what are the various things that go into that. Our website does a lot of things. A lot of people get on it just to, like on an LPS snow day, to find out, is the library open today? They'll use it to find out, of course, if we own certain things. They'll find out if there's story time today. That's where you access electronic resources like genealogy, like software support, like investment help, like car repair. So our website serves a lot of purposes, and I haven't even mentioned really social media. So a lot of people find out about the library through Facebook or through Twitter, and again, expectations. That's an area where people expect a response pretty quickly and expect very up-to-date information. So we are reorganizing some staff positions to provide that kind of information more effectively all the time. So on this indicator, I think that we'll probably be shifting from website to just general availability of the library through electronic means. Now, we did have Beat the Cat at the library not too long ago, and I want to use this opportunity to talk about that we are emphasizing our programming a lot more than we did previously. It's not something that was necessary within the survey, but this adds a way of bringing people into the library, sometimes doing some community-wide sorts of things. For instance, we have a winter reading challenge right now. That's part of an overall national program. What happens as we do that programming is it brings new people to the library and allows them to participate in educational related things in community, and we know that builds community. So here's a program at Isley Branch Library, probably from the summer, again connecting community and education through the library. The Salt Dogs have been really good to us in terms of providing a lot of opportunities for people to engage in reading related activities in the summer in a way that's really fun that they might not always expect. So the programming is becoming more and more important to us, and that's also something nationally that other libraries are seeing, so we're reflecting a national trend there. And then before I finish up, I just want to mention that in addition to libraries in terms of buildings within neighborhoods and libraries in terms of services electronically, we are also working a lot more in terms of community initiatives, community programs, and 15 minutes a day is a good example of that, that the Lincoln City Libraries have really taken the lead in terms of promoting the importance of 15 minutes a day of reading aloud to children before they enter school as really the most effective thing that families can do to prepare their kids for children's success. So we collaborate with the health department, we collaborate with People's Health Center, we work with a lot of people to get that message out. And we see that our being out and about in the community is, again, one of those things that's growing in importance. So as we're staffing libraries, we're thinking, how do we make sure that each library is full of the customer service people that you all need when you use the library, but also are we out in the community making the connections that really make a difference? So again, expectations. Anytime that, say, Pete the Cat or the Salt Dogs visit the library, a question we get is, well, how soon will you have them again? So again, the expectations rise. So for us, in terms of budget implications, as I mentioned, we're likely to want to add a position to oversee our facilities maintenance. We're likely to want to increase the size of our materials budget, and we'll want to be restoring weekday evening hours to Bennett Martin Public Library. And again, those things are all calibrated to meet people's expectations so that as they're expressing their satisfaction with our services, those numbers remain high.
We're just a little bit over. This was our overarching theme in which we talked about livable neighborhoods. The public believes that we have safe, clean, and attractive neighborhoods, but we're growing at 2 Malone neighborhoods a year, and that means that our resources are stretched. The demand to be strategic with money and personnel is all the greater. I hope you can see that work of being strategic and setting priorities is across the various departments. It just ultimately comes down to the resources available to us, as well as how we dispose of those resources. Thank you for your time.
Questions? Mary?
Just a quick question about the data. You've been taking charge since what year?
Are you talking about the survey itself or
Yeah.
the entire program? The survey we first started in 2013, actually 2011, I believe.
Oh, okay. Because the data runs from 2012 on. I just thought that
Yeah,
you'd
actually,
been
it was the end of
surveying.
2011. The data was then given to us in 2012.
So that's just the beginning. So 2012 is the first year you have full data to compare going forward?
Yes.
Okay.
Jane?
Okay, so I have 3 questions. The first one, it would be for Mickey. Where are we at for the completion of the ADA transition in that 15-year? Are we completed with all the curbs and the corner cuts?
So with respect to that, it's a livable document, or living document, not not livable, living documents, so we update it about every 3 years. And it requires submission to MDOT and FHWA. So we are currently in compliance. And as long as we continue to make progress, we really stay out of trouble with DOJ or the feds. So they understand that it's a living document that you amend and update as you get sidewalk repairs and programs completed.
And this one is for Lynn. What is the role of LES at trimming the trees? Because sometimes I see them out and about helping with tree trimming.
Great question. You may notice in some areas of Lincoln that there are power lines that run through some of the trees. If we have to do pruning of those trees, LES will go through and do the line clearance. If we're removing one of those trees, LES will actually remove the upper limbs of the tree and then we'll take down the trunk. So it is a partnership.
Okay, and then the last question is for Chad. The red tag list that you showed, does that include single family and multifamily, or do you break it out between the two?
It could be either, and it could be either or portions of buildings. We can, in terms of a multifamily structure, we can tag individual units or portions. That happens quite frequently.
Okay, so that number that you had included both categories.
Yes.
Okay.
Larry?
My questions are for Lynn also. Are you using the Beehive asset management software yet to do your street tree inventories and tracking? We've had claims come forward. We've seen handwritten notes. If you aren't already using it, how quickly can you get that transition done?
There was actually a meeting last week. The Beehive is developing the system. There was a meeting last week to talk about implementation, so we are on the cusp of being able to start to utilize an electronic workflow and asset management system.
Okay. And then with regard to using volunteers for citizen pruning, what's the difference in your policy for that versus mowing? Because we've asked those questions before, and it have been a lot of pushback on allowing citizens to mow in parks near their homes if they want to. How do you determine where volunteers can be utilized and where they can't?
That's a great question. Some of it is the safety, and having people out mowing in parks, kind of questionable safety. I think the big difference is that to maintain turf's health, you need to mow at a regular height. So if you let the grass grow long and then you cut it short and then it goes long again and you cut it short, it damages it affects the health of the turf over time. With street trees, that's kind of a one-time thing. You're really going in and you're removing lower limbs. So part of the reason that we've tried to minimize volunteer mowing in parks is that we haven't seen somebody do that consistently. Somebody will get very excited about it. They might do it for 2 or 3 times. They then mowed the turf down short after we've got it used to being longer. And so then it takes the turf some time to recover from that. But street tree pruning really is, you go through every 1 or every 2, 3, 5 years and you're removing small limbs.
I asked Lynn the same question at our Livable Neighborhoods meeting, and it was important to note that volunteers who would be pruning trees would be using hand tools, not power tools. No pole saws, no chainsaws, basically pruners.
No rubbers.
We know that's important, don't we, Lynn? My last question for you is about the replacement program for ash trees. You said you're planning to replace on a 1-for-1 basis, but then overall in the park's tree replacement goal is 3 out of the 5 that you take down. Why the difference in replacement ratio?
It's really funding availability. Ideally we'd be replacing everything on a 1-to-1 basis. Today we have funding available to replace the normal number of street trees that we're moving on replacing 3 trees for every 5. We take down someplace between 500 and 700 trees a year normally, and the funding level that we have today allows us to replace about 60% of those. The goal with ash trees is to fund 100% replacement of the ash trees, and as part of the funding request, the number that you saw, to get to a 1-to-1 replacement ratio, we've got to increase the amount of money available to the Emerald Ash Borer program.
Is there some reason why ash trees should need to be replaced at 100% rate? I mean, as opposed to other trees?
It's a great question. I think it's a policy issue. We're very interested in maintaining the community canopy. I think you're right. Ideally, we would probably replace every tree on a 1-to-1 basis. One of the things that some communities have experienced is significant flooding as they've lost their ash tree population. I don't think people realize the impact that those tree canopies have on detaining and slowing down the stormwater. So part of this is from a policy standpoint, saying that when we get done with removing the ash trees, we want to be in a position that we've essentially preserved the tree canopy for the long term and that we haven't diminished it by 40%.
And it isn't part of that rate. I mean, we're talking about the ash trees disappearing in a very short period of
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
whereas the disappearance of the other trees in the community are on a much slower basis because they're dying naturally.
And Rick, that's a good point, because I mentioned that on average we're removing someplace between 500 to 700 trees a year. With ash trees, we're planning to take down 1,000 trees a year. So we're going to triple the number of trees that are coming down in an average year.
Thank you.
John, then Carl.
First of all, I want to thank all of you. Very, very good presentation. Appreciate the way you delineated it and stayed on the timeline. You got up on the screen there, livable neighborhoods, meeting the needs of a growing community. And remember, Joe Hampton always talked about your needs versus your wants. There is nothing in your presentation that is not a good program. But I guess I look to you, we're coming up on our biennial budget meetings, and you've alluded to a few things you want. And I guess the key word is, what is a want? And I also heard the phrase, meeting the community's or people's expectations. And when you've done the surveys and so forth, but as we keep working with limited dollars, how do we define and prioritize these programs versus others? For example, we're looking at a huge street and roads deficit. Can someone help me, or maybe
Sure,
that's just
I'm
some
happy
food
to throw
for
it out
thought?
to you, John. And it depends what council wants to do. But for the last 7 years, every program that we have in the general fund is prioritized in priority order on the mayor's website. And if at some point council, as part of this process early on, would like to take a look at that and make their recommendations on how we shift that around, we'd appreciate that conversation. But as you recall, that does bring up some difficult issues. And John, your point is well taken. There are some things that you have to do. And I think having an affordable housing stock, places for people to live, is probably a higher priority than some other things that may be on the list. But remember, know what you're talking about when you get to that point, when we get towards the bottom of that list. When I showed you that during the budget forecast, the only really big numbers at the low end here are things like a day of library service, neighborhood swimming pools, which don't generate the number of participants that other quadrant pools do. Those are the only things of any heft in order to free up funds to go to the higher priority items. And at this point, we just don't feel like the community has told us that that's a expectation that they're willing to give up. Now, that's part of why we get together in the budget, though, and have that debate is, do we think that's something the community will accept, or is that part of their expectations for us moving forward?
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know that you've really asked the community. You've got some prioritization there, but really strong prioritization that we can discuss in group meetings here between the council and the administration and the directors here is to really say, we can't do it all. Again, I remember right in this room, Alan Abbott and the pre-Antelope Valley had a chart here of 65 programs in public works, and he drew a line at 32. He said, if you do Antelope Valley, I can't do these other 35, 33. And I appreciated that because it was true prioritization, and we all collectively made the decision. Antelope Valley has merits. We'll just set aside some of these others, defer them to the future. And again, as I said in my earlier part of my question is, these are all good programs. I can't say any is bad or has any ill intentions, but it's looking at prioritization and where do we put the dollars. On libraries, I argued that after Gear and Anderson were built, the other quadrants, we did the two, and I said, let's do cyber libraries. That was 20 or 18 years ago. you know, no, we got to do it the same, because every quadrant has to have the same size and everything. I said, well, that's dumbing down. But anyway, okay, so.
I got to address that.
Sure, go
because
ahead.
that's exactly what you can do with that list. Go to the bottom of it. For the first year, we're short $400,000. Go up $400,000. There's your red line. The second year, we're short $1.1 million. Go up from the bottom, and you can get to $1.1 million. It is exactly the program you just lauded Alan Abbott for having done. This is exactly what we're doing here.
Well, and what we need to do, though, is we can't just take the public works silo or the library silo or parks and stuff. We've got to take them all and then say, okay, even between or among silos here, prioritize so we can utilize our dollars. At least that's how I look at the whole prioritization process. Again, I'm not saying anything is bad. I'm just saying we've got to do that.
But that's exactly what that list does. And I need to make that really clear. I've heard the word silos here, and yet you just had 6 different departments come up here and have a conversation about common goals, and that we are prioritizing those programs against one another to determine what the best fit is. I would tell you the best example of that is the reorganization that Mr. Landis talked about in urban development. Departments literally said we are willing to give up power and authority in order to have a better coordinated and better and more effective response. Now think about that statement. That isn't siloing, that is cooperation at its highest level, and why we try to do this system where we look at outcomes and the city has 8 ideas rather than a bunch of departments.
I'd like to go back on the slides there. It was page 19 on ours, but it was the Toledo example, probably page 38 on yours, because you had 2 per page.
I think I passed it.
It's on the sidewalks section.
There you go.
Okay. What's wrong with that picture? Both pictures.
This is the tree line. Those are dead on the right. This is.
I see that. Okay, what else is wrong?
There's no sidewalk.
Right, there's no sidewalks. Okay. I just.
Carl.
All right. So we've heard, well, one of the needs in the community, and this is a need, is for spaces where groups can meet, where health department can take a program and inform people that are interested or need to know that information, where neighborhood organizations can go and have information that they need. And so, Pat, in your discussion about libraries, you didn't really talk much about spaces and meeting spaces and what we have now. And this gets into a little bit into the capital improvement that libraries may be doing. But also I wonder about hours. I mean, is it possible when we are envisioning meeting spaces and maybe reconfiguring some, even our existing libraries, to have meeting spaces that are open, say earlier in the morning than when the library opens? Is that something that could be done to help serve the community?
It could be done. It's a matter for us of figuring out. We probably need to have staff people present, so how to account for having people there earlier. And certainly it's the case that when we made the budget cut 10 years ago, branch libraries previously closed at 9 p.m. and now they close at 8 p.m. And that really impacted meeting room use in the evening because many community groups meet at 7, and so 8 is a little too early for them to leave.
Okay.
So it's a matter of, do we have staff available to have them there if the library's not open, or to stay if they stay later.
Okay. And designing the spaces in such a way where they don't, when you go to a meeting, you don't necessarily have to go into the whole library. You can just...
They can be done that way. Some libraries actually are, what they do is basically they charge if people want to be there before or after.
Right.
And so they make it available.
Sure.
But you would just need to pay for the staff person who has to take care of that.
Okay, thank you.
But, and a variety of spaces as well in terms of larger or smaller areas that need to be heated or cooled in a more effective way.
Okay.
Cindy?
Yeah, thank you. And I echo the thoughts of thanking all of you for being here today. I appreciate this knowledge at this stage. I did have a couple questions for you, Lynn, about the Emerald Ash Borer. Just on your presentation, you mentioned adding 1,200 trees a year. Is that net? I mean, we have trees that die off naturally. Do we automatically replace all of those? And then aren't there some places where we remove trees intentionally that don't have to do with illness? And so I'm just wondering, is that a net number?
That is a net number, so yeah, we're taking out someplace between 500 and 700 trees a year. We replant about 60% of those, and then we're also planting about 1,200, we're planting, that, I can get you the numbers, but it is a net number. Yeah, that 1,200 is a net number, I'm sorry.
Okay, and then I wondered, you had indicated that there's perhaps a need to use chemical treatment to keep some trees alive for a period of time during the whole process. What does it cost, the chemical treatment, to the city? And I'm guessing you're talking about city treated, not the chemicals for private party.
Correct, yeah, this would be, the method we recommend is actually injecting an insecticide into the trunk of the trees. It's carried up into the canopy and it kills the insect. The cost is dependent on the size, the trunk size of the tree. On average, it's about $200 a tree. It has to be done every 2 or 3 years to keep the trees alive.
And how many do you anticipate we would be having treated on an annual basis while we go through the process of removal?
It's a good question. It really is going to depend on how many trees we can get removed prior to emerald ash borer being here. So right now, we're anticipating we probably wouldn't do any treatment until the beginning of 2 bienniums out, because what the research indicates is that the trees can have about 30% damage in the canopy, and if you start treatment at that point, you can still sustain them for a few more years. So we're trying to defer this as long as possible and get as many trees removed as possible to reduce that number that has to be treated.
Do you do treatment prior to the time that there's actually evidence that the EAB is here?
Some people will do that. The recommendation from the experts is that you not begin treatment until emerald ash borer is within 15 miles. We're still outside of the 15-mile radius. To be perfectly honest, we'll probably wait. We'll probably defer that until we start to see a little bit of damage in the public ash trees, just because of the tremendous cost.
And then one more question for you. Thank you. You had indicated that you may be asking, or would be asking, to add staff for emerald ash borer, and maybe to retain that staff afterwards for the purposes of pruning and so forth. Do you know yet what you're looking at for the number of staff you might be asking for?
We're essentially, at this point, the funding that was in last fiscal year and this fiscal year was adequate to purchase the equipment and hire the 9 staff that we'll need for this first phase of emerald ash borer response. So we're not going to be asking for any additional staff in the future, just sustaining those 9 staff positions.
And how many positions are included in that?
A total of 9.
9. Oh, I'm for the arborist.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. That. Thank you for that. Thank you very much. I did have. I guess I had a couple other questions. I don't know how much time we have left. I'm sorry.
None.
We have no time left? Okay. Well, I think I have other questions that I can email, and I think that would be fine. I just took them down.
You can, and do you mind if we answer everyone then, so your colleagues can hear it too, from your email?
Sure, no, I'll be happy to do that, yeah.
Okay, we'd be happy to do that. And if there are any others that occur to you as a result of this, please email, and we'll email everyone back. And you've done that last week, and I thought it was very helpful in follow-up to the discussion, so thank you for that.
Who should we email to?
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Who should we email to?
Me. Give it to me, and then I will make sure that it's gotten out to the departments, and we'll give you a unified answer, because sometimes it cuts across various areas. Good question.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, good discussion.
Great discussion. And a special thank you to all of you who sat and waited. If you feel like coming for some more, we're going to do it again at 5:30 in Chambers. So,
if you just can't get it up.